In 2 years, the U.S. added 525,000 square miles, today home to 89 million Americans. From 1846 to 1848, America waged a war that expanded its territory by 66%, but 2025 demographic analysis reveals the true scale of this conquest. The 8 states carved from Mexican territory now house nearly 1/4 of America's population, generating roughly 1/3 to 2/5 of U.S. economic output. California alone, seized in this conflict, would rank as the world's 5th largest economy if independent. Yet this prosperity was built on what contemporary historians now classify as America's first aggressive war. The scale of what Mexico lost becomes clear when you examine the raw economic power these territories generate today. The numbers game. How 525,000 square miles became America's economic engine. Breaking down these figures reveals the mathematical precision of America's territorial gamble. The United States grew from 1.8 million square miles to 2.3 million square miles, a 28% increase in total landmass achieved through a single military campaign. The Mexican cession territories now produce economic output that dwarfs most nations, representing nearly 40% of total American GDP in 2025. California, Texas, and the other acquired territories alone account for 89 million residents, nearly 1/4 of America's entire population concentrated on formerly Mexican soil. California houses 39 million residents, while Texas adds another 30 million, creating population centers that dwarf most entire nations. California's population exceeds that of Canada, while Texas rivals Saudi Arabia in demographic scale. Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah contribute millions more, transforming what Mexico viewed as sparsely populated frontier into America's demographic powerhouse. The strategic locations Mexico surrendered created the geographic foundation for American continental dominance. The Pacific coastline from San Diego to San Francisco Bay provided maritime access that transformed America from an Atlantic power into a 2-ocean empire. The Sierra Nevada delivered gold deposits worth billions in today's currency, while the Colorado Rockies contain mineral reserves that would fuel American industry for generations. California's Central Valley became the agricultural engine that now produces 25% of America's food supply, while Texas offered vast oil reserves that wouldn't be fully discovered until decades after the war ended. Mexico's leadership in 1848 could not have comprehended what they were surrendering. The concept of California as an agricultural and technological superpower remained decades in the future. The discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill occurred just 9 days before the treaty's signing, a coincidence that makes Mexico's territorial loss seem almost predetermined. Mexican negotiators viewed California as worthless desert punctuated by mission settlements, not the economic engine that would eventually surpass entire European nations in productivity. The economic comparison between individual Mexican cession states and entire countries reveals the magnitude of Mexico's miscalculation. California's GDP exceeds that of the United Kingdom, Germany, or India. Texas generates annual economic output surpassing Canada, Russia, or Brazil. Even smaller acquired states produce economic output matching entire developed nations. Colorado exceeds Israel's economy, while Arizona matches Finland's national productivity. These represent sustained economic advantages built on the geographic lottery Mexico unknowingly surrendered. The transformation from territorial acquisition to economic domination required more than military conquest. The Mexican cession provided America with geographic diversity necessary for sustained growth. Pacific ports enabled direct trade with Asia. Mountain ranges supplied mineral wealth, river valleys offered agricultural potential, and desert regions would eventually yield oil and natural gas reserves. This geographic foundation came with a price tag of approximately $15 million in direct payments to Mexico, roughly 3 cents per acre for some of the most economically productive land on Earth. American expansion created continental power structures that Mexico could never have anticipated. The acquisition of California's coastline meant American merchants could trade directly with China without European intermediaries. The incorporation of Texas positioned America to dominate global energy markets a century before anyone understood petroleum's strategic importance. The addition of Colorado's mineral wealth provided raw materials necessary for American industrialization, while southwestern river systems offered water resources essential for Western development. The pathway to continental dominance required populating and developing these vast spaces. The Mexican cession territories contained fewer than 80,000 Mexican citizens in 1848, population density so sparse that effective governance for Mexico City proved impossible. American settlers arrived in numbers that dwarfed existing populations within a single generation. California's population exploded from roughly 14,000 in 1848 to over 300,000 by 1860, driven initially by the gold rush, but sustained by agricultural and commercial opportunities that Mexican administration had never developed. The mineral wealth extracted from these territories since 1848 exceeds $2 trillion in inflation-adjusted value. California's gold deposits alone generated over $100 billion in today's currency during the initial rush period. Colorado's silver mines produced another $50 billion through the late 1800s, while Texas oil reserves have yielded trillions in economic value since their discovery in 1901. Even modern renewable energy development concentrates heavily in these regions. California leads America in solar power generation, while Texas dominates wind energy production. Population projections suggest that by 2050, over 110 million Americans will live on formerly Mexican land, representing nearly 30% of the total U.S. population. This concentration of human capital in economically advantageous locations creates a self-reinforcing cycle of prosperity that Mexico inadvertently surrendered through military defeat. The Mexican cession transferred America's future economic heartland from one nation to another through a single military campaign. The ports connecting America to Asia, the agricultural regions feeding the continent, the energy reserves powering industrial development, and the population centers driving innovation all trace their American identity to territorial conquests achieved between 1846 and 1848. Yet these staggering economic returns raise uncomfortable questions about how America acquired this continental empire. The mathematical precision of the territorial gains suggests something more calculated than opportunistic expansion, something that demands closer examination of the events that triggered this transformative conflict. The Provocation machine, how Polk engineered America's first aggressive war. James K. Polk entered the presidency in March 1845 with territorial expansion as his primary agenda, but he faced a fundamental problem. The American public, despite their enthusiasm for manifest destiny, still maintained enough moral sensibility to oppose outright aggression against a neighboring republic. Polk needed Mexico to fire the first shot, and he orchestrated events to ensure that happened exactly where and when he wanted. The disputed territory between the Nueces River and Rio Grande provided Polk with the perfect trap. Texas claimed the Rio Grande as its southern boundary based on treaties signed with Santa Anna after the Battle of San Jacinto, but Mexico never recognized these agreements and insisted the Nueces River marked the legitimate border. This created a 150-mile strip of contested land that both nations claimed but neither effectively controlled. The disputed zone contained scattered ranches, small settlements, and military outposts, but no clear governmental authority. Polk recognized this ambiguity as an opportunity to create the incident he needed. The president's strategy required positioning American forces in locations guaranteed to provoke Mexican retaliation while maintaining the appearance of defensive positioning. In March 1846, Polk ordered 2,400 troops under General Zachary Taylor into the disputed zone to protect revenue officers, despite clear Mexican claims to the land. Taylor's forces established Fort Texas directly opposite the Mexican garrison at Matamoros, creating a military confrontation that Mexican commanders could not ignore without appearing weak to their own government. Taylor's positioning served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple provocation. The American camp at the Rio Grande blocked Mexican access to supplies and reinforcements moving north from central Mexico, effectively besieging the Matamoros garrison without formally declaring war. American patrols began operating throughout the disputed territory, intercepting Mexican communications and mapping defensive positions. These activities constituted acts of war by any reasonable definition, but Polk's administration characterized them as routine border security measures. The April 25, 1846 ambush that killed 16 American dragoons occurred exactly as Polk had calculated. Captain Seth Thornton led a reconnaissance patrol of 63 dragoons into an area where Mexican forces had been observed, despite warnings from local residents about increased military activity. The patrol rode directly into a prepared ambush by Mexican cavalry, resulting in Thornton's capture and the deaths of 16 soldiers. The engagement lasted less than 20 minutes, but it provided Polk with the casus belli he had been engineering for months. Polk's response to the ambush revealed the premeditated nature of his war planning. Within hours of receiving news of the skirmish, the president had drafted a message to Congress declaring that Mexico had invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil. This phrase became the rallying cry for war, but it deliberately obscured the reality that American forces had been positioned in disputed territory specifically to create such an incident. The speed of Polk's response suggested that war plans had been prepared well in advance, waiting only for the appropriate trigger. Contemporary military leaders recognized the manipulation taking place, though many remained publicly silent during the conflict. Lieutenant Ulysses Grant later wrote that American forces had been sent into disputed territory to provoke a fight, reflecting the views of many professional soldiers who understood that the Rio Grande positioning served no defensive purpose and could only result in armed conflict. The future president described a war as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation, but these criticisms remained largely private until after the conflict ended. The domestic political pressures driving Polk toward war made peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely as his presidency progressed. The Democratic Party had won the 1844 election on an expansionist platform that promised the annexation of Texas and Oregon, with many supporters expecting similar action regarding California and New Mexico. Polk faced constant pressure from Southern Democrats who viewed territorial expansion as essential for maintaining political balance between slave and free states. Northern Whigs opposed expansion, but lacked sufficient political power to prevent it, while Western Democrats demanded aggressive action to secure California's Pacific ports. Polk's media strategy transformed Mexican retaliation into American victimization through carefully crafted narratives that dominated newspaper coverage. The administration leaked selective information about Mexican military preparations while downplaying American provocations, creating public perception that Mexico posed an imminent threat to American security. Pro-administration newspapers published editorials describing Mexican aggression and unprovoked attacks without mentioning that American forces had deliberately positioned themselves in disputed territory. The phrase "American blood on American soil" appeared in hundreds of newspaper articles, creating emotional response that overwhelmed rational analysis of the circumstances. The systematic escalation of tensions in the disputed zone followed patterns that revealed clear American intent to force military confrontation. Taylor's forces constructed permanent fortifications rather than temporary camps, suggesting long-term occupation rather than defensive positioning. American patrols increased in frequency and range throughout early 1846, penetrating deeper into areas that Mexico considered undisputedly its own territory. These patrols invariably operated in strength sufficient to defeat any Mexican response, but small enough to appear defensive to American public opinion. Mexican attempts to avoid confrontation actually served Polk's purposes by allowing American forces to establish stronger positions in the disputed territory. The Mexican government repeatedly protested American military movements through diplomatic channels, but these protests only provided additional evidence for Polk's claim that Mexico refused to negotiate in good faith. When Mexican forces finally responded with military action, they played directly into the trap that had been set for them. The April 1846 ambush represented the culmination of months of calculated provocation designed to force Mexican retaliation while maintaining American claims of moral superiority. The location of the engagement, the composition of the patrol, and the timing of the incident all suggest careful planning rather than accidental confrontation. Polk had positioned American forces in the exact location where Mexican honor would require a military response, then characterized that response as unprovoked aggression. The blood spilled on that disputed ground between the Nueces and Rio Grande flowed exactly where James K. Polk intended it to flow. The president had engineered America's first aggressive war through deliberate provocation while maintaining the fiction of defensive action. Yet once the shooting started, the conflict revealed military realities that neither side had fully anticipated. Military mismatch, why Mexico never had a fighting chance. Mexican cavalry, though highly skilled, repeatedly failed to shatter American lines against heavier artillery, and Mexican soldiers carried battle scars from decades of internal warfare that American recruits could barely imagine. Yet Mexico lost every major engagement of the war, a military paradox that reveals the brutal mathematics of 19th century industrial warfare. The Disparity began with technology and cascaded through every aspect of military organization, creating a mismatch so severe that individual Mexican heroism could never overcome systemic American advantages. The Battle of Palo Alto demonstrated how technological gaps could decide entire campaigns within hours. American rifled cannons outranged Mexican smoothbores, devastating enemy lines, while Mexican artillery frequently fell short. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Mexican soldiers had never faced artillery barrages of such intensity or precision, while American gunners had trained extensively on the latest weaponry produced by northern foundries. The difference measured more than mere firepower. It represented the gap between pre-industrial and industrial military systems. Mexican political chaos created military paralysis that no amount of battlefield courage could overcome. Between independence in 1821 and 1855, the Mexican presidency changed hands 50 times, creating a governmental structure incapable of sustained military planning or consistent resource allocation. Each new administration brought different priorities, military appointments, and strategic approaches, preventing the development of coherent war plans or professional military institutions. American commanders faced a single government with clear objectives, while their Mexican counterparts served multiple competing factions simultaneously. The independence war against Spain had already gutted Mexico's capacity for external warfare before American forces crossed the Rio Grande. 500,000 Mexicans died during the decade-long struggle for independence from a total population of 6.5 million, proportional casualties that would have devastated any nation's military potential. The economic devastation proved equally severe, with Spanish administrators destroying silver mines essential for financing military operations. Mexico entered the American War with a depleted population, ruined economy, and military forces designed for fighting Spanish colonial troops rather than an expanding industrial power. American industrial capacity generated logistical advantages that Mexican commanders could never match through tactical brilliance alone. Northern factories produced standardized weapons, ammunition, and equipment in quantities that dwarfed Mexican manufacturing capability. American quartermasters could feed, clothe, and arm troops across thousands of miles of supply lines, while Mexican soldiers often fought in rags with obsolete weapons and empty stomachs. The ability to move large armies over vast distances while maintaining adequate supplies represented a fundamental military revolution that Mexico's pre-industrial economy could not compete with. Of 104,556 U.S. soldiers who fought, 13,780 died, the highest mortality ratio in U.S. Army history tied to epidemic disease in unsanitary camps. Yet these losses never threatened American military capacity because the industrial system could replace both men and equipment faster than Mexico could inflict casualties. Mexican forces faced the impossible task of defending territories they could neither adequately supply nor effectively reinforce. The distances from Mexico City to California, New Mexico, and Texas exceeded the logistical capabilities of any pre-industrial military system. West Point training and American military engineering created tactical advantages that multiplied the impact of superior resources and technology. American officers had studied European military theory, fortification design, and artillery science in ways that their Mexican counterparts lacked access to. This educational foundation enabled American forces to overcome Mexican fortifications, coordinate complex maneuvers, and adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions. The engineering expertise proved particularly valuable in siege warfare, where American forces consistently breached Mexican defensive positions through systematic approaches rather than costly frontal assaults. Mexican commanders simultaneously fought American invaders and internal enemies, dividing their attention and resources in ways that guaranteed defeat on both fronts. Regional caudillos pursued personal ambitions that conflicted with national defense priorities, while political factions in Mexico City maneuvered for advantage, even as foreign armies occupied national territory. Santa Anna himself embodied this contradiction, using the war as an opportunity to regain political power rather than focusing exclusively on military victory. The communication breakdown between Mexico City and frontier commanders created a military organization that functioned more like separate armies than coordinated forces. Messages took weeks to travel from a capital to California or New Mexico, making centralized command and control impossible during rapidly developing military situations. Mexican commanders and distant. Territories made critical decisions without current information about overall strategic objectives or available reinforcements. American forces exploited these communication delays repeatedly, moving faster than Mexican information networks could track or respond to their movements. Mexico's military structure reflected its primary mission of internal control rather than external defense against industrial powers. Mexican forces were organized, trained, and equipped for suppressing domestic rebellions and maintaining order among civilian populations. This orientation emphasized cavalry for mobility across vast territories and light infantry for occupation duties, but provided little preparation for fighting against coordinated artillery, engineering units, and logistical systems that characterized modern warfare. The resource disparity extended beyond simple wealth to encompass the entire industrial ecosystem necessary for sustained military operations. American forces could replace losses in personnel and equipment through established recruitment and manufacturing systems, while Mexican losses became permanent degradations of overall military capability. American soldiers carried standardized weapons with interchangeable parts and reliable ammunition supplies, while Mexican troops used whatever weapons they could obtain or capture. Mexican soldiers fought with personal courage that impressed even their enemies, but individual heroism could not overcome systematic disadvantages that shaped every aspect of military performance. The mathematical reality of industrial warfare meant that better supplied, better equipped, and better coordinated forces would prevail regardless of individual valor or tactical skill. Mexican cavalry charges and defensive stands became legendary for their bravery, but they could not overcome artillery superiority, logistical advantages, and communication capabilities that gave American forces decisive advantages in every major engagement. Yet among all the territories that Mexico would lose, one stood apart from the rest in terms of strategic value and future economic potential. The prize that American strategists coveted most would prove worth every calculation they had made about why this territory was worth any price. California's $3.6 trillion GDP ranks it behind only the U.S., China, Japan, and Germany, making it the world's fifth largest economy if it were an independent nation. This economic powerhouse generates nearly 15% of America's total economic output from a single state, validating every calculation made by American strategists in the 1840s who viewed California as the ultimate prize in westward expansion. With nearly 40 million residents, California would rank as the 38th most populous country globally, with more people than Canada, Australia, or Greece. The territory that Mexico controlled so loosely has become the economic engine that drives American prosperity in the 21st century. American military planners recognized California's strategic value decades before the gold rush revealed its mineral wealth. The territory offered something that no amount of eastern expansion could provide: direct access to Pacific trade routes that would connect America to the vast markets of China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Control of California's natural harbors meant American merchants could bypass European intermediaries and establish direct commercial relationships with Asian trading partners. San Francisco Bay alone contained enough protected anchorage to shelter the world's entire merchant marine fleet, while the California coastline offered multiple natural harbors suitable for commercial and military purposes. This vision of Pacific commerce drove American ambitions far more than any immediate economic returns from California's sparse population or undeveloped resources. The Mexican population in California numbered fewer than 8,000 people scattered across a territory larger than most European nations. This demographic reality made California practically defenseless against any organized effort at conquest or internal revolution. Mexican authorities maintained loose control through a handful of presidios and missions, but these installations were designed to manage Native American populations rather than defend against foreign invasion. The vast distances between settlements and the minimal military presence created a power vacuum that American settlers quickly recognized and exploited. Mexican ranchers controlled enormous land grants that stretched across hundreds of thousands of acres, but they lacked the population density or military organization necessary to resist American immigration or political pressure. The Californios lived comfortable lives managing cattle ranches and engaging in hide and tallow trade with American merchants, but their political loyalty to Mexico City remained tenuous at best. Many Californio families had established commercial relationships with American traders that proved more profitable and reliable than their connections to Mexican authorities. The Bear Flag Revolt demonstrated how easily American settlers could overwhelm Mexican authority through coordinated political action backed by minimal military force. In June 1846, 33 American settlers captured the town of Sonoma and declared California an independent republic. This amateur revolution succeeded because no significant Mexican military force existed to oppose it. The Bear Flag Republic lasted only 25 days before American naval forces arrived to claim California for the United States, but those 3 weeks proved that Mexican control of California existed more on paper than in reality. American settlers had been infiltrating California for years before the Bear Flag Revolt, establishing businesses, purchasing land, and marrying into Californio families. This gradual immigration created a pro-American faction within California society that facilitated the territory's eventual conquest. Unlike the situation in Texas, where American settlers arrived in organized groups with clear political objectives, California's American population grew through individual initiative and commercial opportunity. This organic process made American takeover appear less like foreign invasion and more like natural demographic evolution. The discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in January 1848 occurred just 9 days before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo officially transferred California to American control, creating one of history's most fortuitous coincidences. American negotiators had already secured California through military conquest, but the gold discovery validated their strategic calculations in ways that no amount of planning could have predicted. The mineral wealth that poured out of California's mountains during the 1850s exceeded the wildest dreams of American expansionists who had coveted the territory primarily for its Pacific ports and agricultural potential. British interest in California created urgency for American action that transformed what might have been gradual westward expansion into immediate military priority. British naval vessels regularly visited California ports, while British merchants established trading relationships with Californio ranchers that suggested preparation for eventual political control. The possibility that Britain might establish a Pacific foothold in North America forced American policymakers to act decisively rather than waiting for gradual demographic pressure to achieve their territorial objectives. The specter of British California accelerated American military planning and justified aggressive action against Mexico. American forces secured California with remarkable speed compared to campaigns in other theaters of the Mexican-American War. The combination of minimal Mexican military presence, pro-American sentiment among settlers, and superior American naval power enabled conquest of the entire territory within months of the war's beginning. While American armies struggled against determined Mexican resistance in Texas and central Mexico, California fell to American control through a series of brief engagements that demonstrated the territory's military vulnerability. The rapid American conquest of California validated strategic planning that had begun years before the war officially started. American naval commanders had surveyed California's coastline extensively, mapping harbors and identifying key military positions that would need to be secured in case of conflict with Mexico. This advanced planning enabled American forces to occupy critical locations immediately upon the outbreak of hostilities, preventing any organized Mexican resistance from developing. The economic statistics from 2025 prove that American strategists in the 1840s correctly identified California as the ultimate prize in westward expansion. The territory that Mexico valued so lightly has become the foundation of American economic dominance in the Pacific, generating wealth that exceeds the total economic output of most nations. California's transformation from sparsely populated Mexican frontier to global economic powerhouse represents the most successful territorial acquisition in American history. Yet Mexico's response to losing this prize would depend entirely on the decisions of one man whose reliability had already proven questionable to both sides of the conflict. Santa Anna's gamble, the dictator who sealed Mexico's fate. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna agreed to American terms while in exile in Cuba, promising President Polk he would end the war favorably for America if the United States helped him return from exile to reclaim power in Mexico. The Mexican dictator initiated secret negotiations with Washington in 1846, offering to negotiate territorial concessions that would satisfy American expansionist ambitions without prolonged warfare. This remarkable proposition came from Mexico's most recognizable political figure, a man who had dominated Mexican politics for decades through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and shameless opportunism. Polk accepted the deal, believing he could manipulate Santa Anna into delivering the territorial gains America desired through diplomacy rather than extended military campaigns. The American president ordered his naval commanders to allow Santa Anna safe passage through the blockade of Mexican ports, enabling the exiled dictator's return to Veracruz in August 1846. This decision represented a calculated gamble by Polk, who assumed that Santa Anna's hunger for power would override any patriotic sentiments about defending Mexican territory. The arrangement seemed logical from Washington's perspective. Santa Anna had already demonstrated his willingness to negotiate away Texas independence in exchange for his personal freedom after the Battle of San Jacinto. American policymakers expected similar pragmatism regarding California and New Mexico, territories that Santa Anna had never governed effectively during his previous periods in power. Santa Anna betrayed the agreement within weeks of setting foot on Mexican soil, raising 20,000 troops to fight the very Americans who had facilitated his return to power. The dictator's immediate reversal shocked American officials who had underestimated both his political cunning and his understanding of Mexican public opinion. Santa Anna recognized that any Mexican leader who negotiated away national territory to foreign invaders would face immediate political destruction and probable assassination. His survival instincts, honed through decades of Mexican political warfare, demanded that he position himself as the defender of national honor rather than as America's collaborator. The Army Santa Anna assembled represented the largest Mexican military force of the entire war, drawn from central Mexican states that had remained largely untouched by American invasion. These troops possessed higher morale and better equipment than the frontier garrisons that had already fallen to American forces, while their commander brought tactical experience from decades of civil warfare. Santa Anna understood that military success against the Americans would solidify his political position in ways that no amount of negotiation could achieve. The dictator had transformed himself from potential American puppet into Mexico's primary hope for military victory. The Battle of Buena Vista on February 23 to 24, 1847, brought Santa Anna closest to achieving the decisive victory that might have changed the war's trajectory. His forces faced Zachary Taylor's Americans in mountainous terrain that favored defensive tactics and could neutralize American artillery advantages. Santa Anna's battle plan called for coordinated attacks that would overwhelm American positions through superior numbers and aggressive maneuvering. The fighting lasted 2 days, with Mexican forces achieving initial breakthroughs that brought them within hours of complete victory over Taylor's army. Santa Anna's political calculations undermined his military effectiveness at the crucial moment when victory seemed within reach. Rather than pressing his advantage at Buena Vista, the dictator began considering how battlefield success would affect his position in Mexico City politics. His primary concern shifted from defeating the Americans to ensuring that military victory would translate into sustainable political power. This divided focus created hesitation during critical moments when decisive action might have routed Taylor's forces and potentially altered the entire war's outcome. The dictator's retreat from Buena Vista demonstrated his pattern of prioritizing political survival over military objectives, a characteristic that had defined his entire career. Despite achieving tactical advantages that American commanders later admitted brought them close to defeat, Santa Anna withdrew his forces rather than risk the casualties that total victory would require. His political instincts warned him that excessive losses among central Mexican troops would weaken his domestic position regardless of any strategic gains achieved against foreign invaders. Santa Anna's reputation for unreliability became a strategic liability that damaged Mexico's war effort beyond the immediate military consequences of his battlefield decisions. Mexican regional commanders doubted his commitment to sustained resistance, while potential foreign allies questioned whether Mexico possessed the political stability necessary for effective military cooperation. His history of broken promises and shifting allegiances created skepticism about Mexican resolve that influenced everything from arms purchases to diplomatic negotiations. The dictator's focus on political maneuvering consumed energy, and attention that should have been directed toward military planning and execution. Throughout the war, Santa Anna devoted significant resources to monitoring domestic political rivals and managing relationships with regional caudillos who might challenge his authority. These political distractions prevented him from developing coherent strategic plans or maintaining the consistent focus necessary for effective military leadership against professional American forces. Santa Anna's retreat from Buena Vista effectively ended organized Mexican resistance in the northern theater, allowing American forces to consolidate their control over the disputed territories without facing serious military opposition. His withdrawal sent a clear message to other Mexican commanders that even the nation's most experienced military leader considered the northern territories indefensible against American invasion. This psychological impact proved as devastating as any tactical defeat, undermining Mexican morale throughout the remaining theaters of operation. The pattern of losing battles, fleeing the field, and then returning to power had served Santa Anna well during decades of civil warfare, but proved catastrophic when facing foreign invasion. His tactical retreats might preserve his personal political position, but they surrendered Mexican territory to permanent American occupation. The dictator's survival strategies worked effectively against domestic opponents who shared his interest in avoiding total destruction, but they failed completely against American forces seeking territorial conquest rather than political accommodation. Santa Anna's gamble with American cooperation failed because he underestimated both his opponent's determination and his own people's expectations. His betrayal of Polk's arrangement and subsequent military failures left Mexico's heartland exposed to an even more audacious American strategy that would target the very seat of Mexican power. Scott's Impossible March, the campaign that broke Mexico's will. Winfield Scott's march from Veracruz to Mexico City ranks among the most audacious military campaigns in American history, a 300-mile advance through enemy territory that military historians still study today. The Duke of Wellington called it unsurpassed in military. Annals, in his dispatch following the Veracruz landing, high praise from Europe's most celebrated military commander. Scott's army of 10,000 men would traverse the same route that Hernán Cortés had used to conquer the Aztec Empire 3 centuries earlier, but where the Spanish conquistador had taken months to reach his destination. Scott planned to do it in weeks while fighting a modern army equipped with artillery and professional soldiers. The campaign began on March 9, 1847, with the largest amphibious landing in military history until World War II, as Scott's forces assaulted the fortress city of Veracruz. American naval vessels transported 8,600 troops and their equipment across the Gulf of Mexico, then coordinated a beach landing that put the entire force ashore within hours. Mexican forces at Veracruz had expected the Americans to attack the city directly from the sea, but Scott chose to land south of the fortress and conduct a formal siege. The bombardment continued for 3 weeks, with American guns firing over 6,700 shells that reduced sections of Veracruz's walls to rubble. The city surrendered on March 29, 1847, giving Scott the secure base he needed for his advance into Mexico's interior. Scott's decision to cut his supply lines and live off the Mexican countryside violated every principle of conventional military wisdom and should have resulted in disaster for his army. Traditional military doctrine required secure communications and supply routes back to friendly territory, but Scott recognized that maintaining such lines would require half his force and create vulnerabilities that Mexican guerrillas could exploit. Instead, he chose to advance rapidly with minimal baggage trains, forcing his troops to forage for food and supplies from a local population. This strategy worked only because central Mexico possessed sufficient agricultural resources to support a foreign army, and because Scott's forces moved too quickly for organized Mexican resistance to develop. The Battle of Cerro Gordo on April 18, 1847, opened the path to Mexico City through a tactical masterpiece executed by Robert E. Lee. Santa Anna had positioned 12,000 troops in a mountain pass that controlled the main road from Veracruz to the capital, creating what appeared to be an impregnable defensive position. Lee conducted a personal reconnaissance that identified a narrow mountain trail that would allow American forces to outflank the Mexican positions. The flanking maneuver required troops to drag artillery pieces up steep mountainsides during the night, positioning them behind Mexican lines by dawn. When Scott's main force attacked the pass from the front, Lee's flanking force struck from the rear, creating panic among Mexican defenders who found themselves caught between 2 American attacks. The victory at Cerro Gordo destroyed Santa Anna's army as an effective fighting force and demonstrated that no Mexican position could withstand American tactical innovation and engineering expertise. Scott's 8,500 men had routed a larger Mexican force through superior planning and coordination, capturing 3,000 prisoners and all of Santa Anna's artillery. The psychological impact proved as significant as the tactical victory, as Mexican commanders throughout central Mexico learned that American forces could outmaneuver and defeat even carefully prepared defensive positions. The battle established American tactical superiority so convincingly that many Mexican units abandoned their positions rather than face similar destruction. American forces deep in Mexico's heartland created psychological pressure that affected Mexican morale far beyond the immediate military situation. The presence of foreign troops within 200 miles of the capital shattered Mexican confidence in their government's ability to defend national territory. Citizens who had never seen American soldiers suddenly found foreign armies marching through their towns, requisitioning supplies, and demonstrating military capabilities that exceeded anything Mexico could match. The psychological warfare proved as effective as actual combat, as Mexican resistance crumbled in areas where American forces had not yet appeared. The siege of Mexico City and the final assault on Chapultepec Castle represented the climax of Scott's campaign and the end of organized Mexican resistance. Chapultepec served as Mexico's military academy and the last major fortification protecting the capital, defended by 1,000 regular troops and teenage cadets who had refused evacuation orders. The fortress occupied a strategic hilltop that dominated the approaches to Mexico City, requiring American forces to conduct a direct assault against prepared positions. Scott's artillery bombardment on September 12, 1847, breached the castle's walls, but Mexican defenders continued fighting from room to room even after American troops entered the fortress. The heroic last stand of the Niños Héroes at Chapultepec became Mexico's final symbol of resistance and one of the war's most tragic episodes. 6 teenage cadets chose death over surrender, with Juan Escotilla reportedly wrapping himself in the Mexican flag before jumping from the castle walls rather than face capture. These young soldiers, some barely 16 years old, embodied Mexican determination to resist foreign conquest even when military defeat had become inevitable. Their sacrifice provided Mexico with martyrs who demonstrated that individual courage could preserve national honor even when armies failed to preserve national territory. The fall of Mexico City on September 14, 1847, marked the moment when Mexico's defeat became inevitable and further resistance pointless. American forces occupied the National Palace, effectively ending Mexican governmental authority and forcing recognition that military victory was impossible. Scott's campaign had achieved total victory through a combination of tactical brilliance, strategic planning, and technological superiority that established American military reputation for generations to come. Yet the price of this triumph would prove far steeper than anyone had calculated, measured not just in territory gained, but in the human cost that would shock both shaped two nations. Of the 104,556 American soldiers who fought, 13,780 died, a mortality rate that shocked even hardened military commanders and established the highest casualty ratio in United States Army history. Disease and exposure killed 10,790 American soldiers, while Mexican bullets accounted for fewer than 3,000 combat deaths, a disparity that highlighted the primitive medical understanding of the era. Dysentery, typhoid fever, yellow fever, and cholera swept through American camps with devastating efficiency, turning military hospitals into death houses where soldiers who had survived Mexican artillery succumbed to microscopic enemies they could neither see nor fight. American military camps became breeding grounds for epidemic diseases that medical science cannot identify or treat effectively. Soldiers drank contaminated water, ate spoiled provisions, and lived in unsanitary conditions that guaranteed widespread illness in tropical and desert climates their bodies had never experienced. Medical officers recorded symptoms but possessed no understanding of disease transmission, creating conditions where a single infected water source could kill more Americans than an entire Mexican regiment. The mortality rates varied dramatically by region, with troops stationed in coastal areas suffering higher death rates from yellow fever and malaria, while soldiers in mountainous regions faced different but equally deadly respiratory infections and exposure-related deaths. The war inflicted devastating disruption on Mexican civilian populations in occupied territories, though military records never systematically documented these casualties. American forces requisitioned food, livestock, and supplies from Mexican communities that possessed minimal surplus resources, creating hardship conditions that particularly affected children and elderly residents. The displacement of civilian populations from their homes and farms disrupted agricultural cycles and traditional economic relationships that had sustained Mexican communities for centuries. The demographic transformation of conquered territories created permanent changes that affected millions of people whose citizenship changed overnight without their consent or participation. Approximately 75,000 Mexican citizens lived in the territories transferred to American control, suddenly finding themselves foreign residents in their ancestral homelands. These populations faced immediate challenges regarding property rights, legal status, and cultural preservation as American legal systems replaced Mexican institutions they had known throughout their lives. American military commanders who survived the war would later lead opposing armies during the Civil War, creating a generation of leaders whose tactical knowledge derived from fighting Mexico rather than each other. Ulysses Grant, Robert E. Lee, William T. Sherman, Stonewall Jackson, and dozens of other future Civil War generals learned battlefield command during the Mexican campaigns, studying each other's methods and developing professional relationships that would later turn tragic when they faced each other across Civil War battlefields. The Mexican-American War served as a training ground for the military leaders who would determine America's survival as a unified nation. The psychological trauma inflicted on Mexican national identity created wounds that would never fully heal, establishing patterns of resentment and distrust that affected Mexican-American relations for generations. The experience of foreign invasion, military defeat, and territorial dismemberment challenged fundamental assumptions about Mexican sovereignty and national destiny that had sustained the country since independence. Mexican intellectuals and political leaders struggled to explain how their nation had lost half its territory to a neighbor they had previously viewed as culturally and militarily inferior. Mexican citizens who became American residents faced systematic discrimination and legal challenges that violated the property protections promised in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. American courts consistently ruled against Mexican land claims using legal procedures and evidence requirements that Mexican residents could not meet, resulting in the loss of millions of acres of ancestral property. The Spanish and Mexican land grant system conflicted with American legal traditions, creating opportunities for American settlers and speculators to acquire Mexican-owned property through legal manipulation rather than legitimate purchase. The war's impact on Mexico's already weakened population proved catastrophic in ways that extended far beyond immediate military casualties. The loss of northern territories removed approximately one-third of Mexico's total land area, along with the most economically productive regions outside the Central Valley. Mining districts, agricultural areas, and trade routes that had generated revenue for the Mexican government disappeared overnight, creating fiscal crises that would plague Mexico for decades following the war's conclusion. Mexican economic disruption extended beyond territorial loss to encompass the destruction of transportation networks, commercial relationships, and financial institutions that had connected northern and central Mexico. The war severed economic links between Mexico City and California, Texas, and New Mexico that had sustained trade and cultural exchange since colonial times. Mexican merchants who had built businesses serving northern territories suddenly found their markets occupied by foreign competitors operating under different legal and commercial systems. The demographic consequences affected both nations in ways that would reshape North American population patterns for generations. American settlement of conquered territories accelerated dramatically after the war, with the California Gold Rush bringing hundreds of thousands of settlers to regions that had contained sparse Mexican populations. The rapid demographic transformation created new American communities in former Mexican territories while simultaneously displacing Mexican residents who could not compete economically with American immigrants. Mexican families separated by the new international border faced permanent divisions that destroyed extended kinship networks spanning what had previously been a single nation. The Rio Grande boundary cut through communities where families had lived on both sides of the river for generations, creating international barriers where none had existed previously. Mexican citizens who chose to remain in American territory often lost contact with relatives in Mexico, while those who relocated to Mexico abandoned property and communities they had spent lifetimes building. The territories acquired through the war now contain over 89 million American residents whose presence traces directly to the demographic transformations initiated by military conquest between 1846 and 1848. The human cost of territorial expansion created the geographic foundation for population concentrations that continue to drive American economic and political development into the 21st century. These casualties represented more than military statistics. They marked the transformation of North America through conquest that would require some form of legal justification to satisfy both international opinion and American domestic sensibilities about the methods used to achieve continental expansion. The $15 million question: how America bought its guilt. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo's $15 million payment represented America's calculated attempt to transform naked conquest into legitimate commerce, a financial fig leaf designed to cover the moral nakedness of territorial seizure through military force. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded 500,000 square miles for $15 million, working out to under $2 per acre for land that would become some of the most economically productive territory on Earth. The mathematical absurdity becomes clear when comparing this price to modern real estate values in Los Angeles, San Francisco, or Denver, where individual city blocks now sell for more than Mexico received for entire states. American negotiators understood that the payments served domestic political purposes as much as international legal ones. Northern politicians who had opposed the war as immoral aggression could now claim that America had purchased rather than stolen Mexican territory. The financial transaction allowed Congress to frame territorial expansion as a commercial deal between willing partners rather than the result of military conquest. This narrative proved essential for maintaining American self-image as a nation that respected international law and property rights even while expanding through warfare. The treaty promised comprehensive legal protections for approximately 75,000 Mexican citizens who suddenly found themselves living in American territory. These guarantees included the right to retain their property, practice Catholic religion, maintain their language and culture, and choose between Mexican and American citizenship within 1 year. The document specified that Mexican land grants would be respected under American law, while existing legal contracts and commercial relationships would remain valid under the new sovereignty. These provisions appeared generous on paper, creating the impression that America intended to treat its new Mexican-American population fairly and according to established legal principles. The systematic violation of these treaty protections began almost immediately after American territorial control was established. California courts often refused to honor Mexican land grants, stripping Mexican residents of property despite treaty guarantees. The burden of proof fell on Mexican claimants to demonstrate ownership through legal procedures. Conducted in English, using American legal concepts that had no equivalent in Mexican law. This legal framework effectively guaranteed that most Mexican property claims would fail regardless of their historical validity or moral legitimacy. American settlers and speculators exploited these legal vulnerabilities to acquire millions of acres of Mexican-owned land through quasi-legal mechanisms that violated the treaty spirit while technically conforming to its letter. The California Land Commission, established to adjudicate Mexican property claims, operated under procedures so complex and expensive that many Mexican families bankrupted themselves attempting to prove ownership of ancestral lands. Legal fees often exceeded the value of disputed property, forcing Mexican landowners to sell their claims to American speculators who possessed the financial resources necessary to navigate the legal system. The payment's political necessity for domestic American consumption became apparent during congressional debates over treaty ratification. Northern representatives who had criticized the war as unjust aggression could support the treaty by emphasizing the financial compensation provided to Mexico. The $15 million payment created political cover for legislators who needed to justify territorial acquisition to constituents opposed to aggressive warfare. This domestic political calculation mattered more than any international legal considerations, as American policymakers understood that successful territorial expansion required popular support for incorporation of conquered lands. Mexico's desperate financial situation following the war made any payment appear significant to government officials struggling with national bankruptcy. The Mexican treasury contained virtually no funds for basic governmental operations, while foreign creditors demanded payment on loans contracted during previous political crises. The $15 million represented immediate relief from fiscal catastrophe, enabling the Mexican government to meet pressing obligations and maintain basic administrative functions. This financial desperation influenced Mexican negotiators to accept terms they might have rejected under different economic circumstances. The assumption of American citizen claims against Mexico added another $3.25 million to the total compensation, bringing the complete financial package to approximately $18.25 million. These claims resulted from damages to American property and persons during Mexico's political upheavals, representing legitimate debts that Mexico could not pay from its own resources. The claim settlement removed a significant source of diplomatic tension while demonstrating American willingness to resolve financial disputes through legal procedures rather than military action. Evidence of systematic treaty violation emerged within months of ratification as American territorial governments ignored Mexican property rights and cultural protections. California's state constitution prohibited Mexican citizens from voting or holding office despite treaty guarantees of political participation. Local officials refused to conduct government business in Spanish, effectively excluding Mexican residents from civic participation in their own communities. These violations occurred with federal government knowledge and tacit approval, demonstrating that treaty provisions were viewed as temporary expedients rather than permanent legal obligations. The long-term legal consequences of treaty violations created diplomatic tensions that persisted for generations, affecting Mexican-American relations well into the 20th century. Mexican governments repeatedly protested American failure to honor treaty obligations, citing specific examples of property confiscation and civil rights violations. These protests established patterns of Mexican distrust toward American promises that influenced subsequent diplomatic negotiations and border disputes. The 2025 economic analysis reveals the treaty's $15 million payment as perhaps the most profitable real estate transaction in human history. The territories acquired through this payment now generate over $11 trillion in annual economic output, representing a return on investment that exceeds 700,000% over the intervening 177 years. California alone produces $3.6 trillion yearly, meaning the state's annual GDP exceeds the original purchase price by a factor of 240,000. The $15 million represented America's attempt to purchase moral legitimacy for territorial conquest, but the systematic violation of treaty protections revealed the payment's true purpose as political theater rather than genuine compensation for Mexican losses. Yet this territorial triumph would immediately create an even more dangerous crisis that threatened to destroy the very nation that had achieved such a spectacular expansion. How victory planted the seeds of civil war. The question that would define America's future emerged from the ashes of military victory. Would slavery expand into the territories seized from Mexico? Within months of triumph, the slavery debate transformed from a manageable regional disagreement into a national emergency that nearly destroyed the Union 11 years before Fort Sumter. The territorial gains that Americans celebrated as manifest destiny became the geographic foundation for sectional warfare that would consume American politics for the next 15 years. David Wilmot's proviso emerged as the first shot fired in this political war, introduced in Congress on August 8, 1846, just months after American forces crossed into Mexico. The Pennsylvania representative proposed that slavery be banned from any territory acquired through the Mexican conflict, creating a legislative proposal that would fundamentally alter the balance of power between slave and free states. The Wilmot proviso never became law after defeat in the Senate, but it crystallized the fears and ambitions of both sections while establishing the terms of debate that would dominate American politics until Fort Sumter. Northern representatives rallied behind the proviso as a moral imperative, while Southern politicians denounced it as an assault on their constitutional rights and economic interests. The Missouri Compromise's carefully constructed balance crumbled under the weight of territorial expansion that no one had anticipated when that agreement was negotiated in 1820. The original compromise had maintained sectional peace by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as free, while prohibiting slavery north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel in the remaining Louisiana Purchase territory. This formula worked as long as territorial expansion proceeded gradually and predictably, but the Mexican cession added over 500,000 square miles of territory whose status could not be determined by existing precedents. The sheer scale of territorial acquisition overwhelmed the mathematical formulas that had maintained sectional balance for nearly 3 decades. California's immediate application for statehood as a free state created the first major crisis, threatening to give free states a permanent majority in the Senate. The discovery of gold in January 1848 had attracted hundreds of thousands of settlers who drafted a constitution prohibiting slavery, but California's admission would break the numerical equality between slave and free states that had preserved sectional balance since 1820. Southern politicians recognized that permanent minority status in the Senate would leave them defenseless against future anti-slavery legislation, while Northern representatives saw California statehood as the natural result of democratic principles and territorial expansion. The political maneuvering surrounding California statehood revealed how completely territorial expansion had changed the fundamental calculations of American politics. Southern leaders threatened secession if California entered as a free state, while Northern politicians insisted that slavery could not be imposed on territories where residents had democratically rejected it. The constitutional crisis deepened as both sections questioned whether the Union could survive if their essential interests were permanently threatened by the other side's political dominance. Henry Clay's Compromise of 1850 temporarily defused the immediate crisis through a complex package of measures designed to satisfy both sections' essential demands while avoiding definitive resolution of the slavery question. California entered as a free state, but the territories of Utah and New Mexico were organized without restrictions on slavery, allowing residents to decide the question through popular sovereignty. The compromise also strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, requiring Northern citizens to assist in capturing runaway slaves while abolishing the slave trade in Washington, D.C. This legislative package preserved the Union by postponing rather than resolving the fundamental questions raised by territorial expansion. The geographic framework created by the Mexican-American War established the physical boundaries within which future sectional conflicts would unfold. The vast territories stretching from California to the Rio Grande became contested ground where pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces would compete for political control throughout the 1850s. Every territorial election, every application for statehood, and every decision about territorial governance became opportunities for sectional confrontation. The war had given America the stage upon which its greatest political drama would be performed. Popular sovereignty emerged as the preferred solution for managing slavery in the territories, but this concept proved to be political dynamite rather than compromise formula. The idea that territorial residents should decide the slavery question for themselves appeared democratic and fair, but it guaranteed that every territorial election would become a national battleground between competing sectional interests. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 extended this principle by repealing the Missouri Compromise entirely, leading to the violent conflicts known as Bleeding Kansas that demonstrated how territorial governance had become impossible under the existing political system. The Fugitive Slave Act proved particularly inflammatory in northern states, where residents found themselves legally required to participate in the capture and return of runaway slaves. This law brought the reality of slavery into northern communities that had previously been able to ignore the institution's existence, creating personal moral crises for individuals who had never been forced to choose between legal compliance and ethical conviction. The act transformed abstract political disagreements about slavery in distant territories into immediate moral challenges that northern citizens faced in their own neighborhoods. Military victory over Mexico created political disaster at home by forcing Americans to confront fundamental contradictions about slavery and democracy that they had successfully avoided through previous compromises. The territories acquired through warfare could not be governed according to existing formulas, while the scale of territorial expansion made traditional compromise solutions impossible to implement. Every attempt to resolve the slavery question in one territory created new problems in others, generating a cascade of political crises that overwhelmed the capacity of existing institutions to manage sectional conflict. The slavery debate in territories acquired from Mexico transformed regional political disagreements into moral crusades that admitted no compromise or accommodation. The Mexican-American War had been fought to expand American territory, but its ultimate consequence was to make American territorial governance impossible under existing constitutional arrangements. The very success of territorial expansion created the conditions that made civil war inevitable, as the nation discovered that military victory over foreign enemies provided no protection against the internal contradictions that territorial expansion had exposed and intensified. Yet, this recognition of the war's destructive domestic consequences would take generations of historical scholarship to fully understand and acknowledge. Modern Reckoning: How 2025 Historians Judge America's First Aggressive War. Today's historians view the war not as divine mandate, but as calculated aggression justified by manifest destiny rhetoric. This academic shift marks a fundamental departure from 20th century scholarship that often celebrated the conflict as a triumph of American expansion and democratic ideals. Ulysses S. Grant, who served as a young officer in the war, later wrote in his memoirs that it was one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation, a judgment that contemporary historians increasingly embrace. Modern historical analysis strips away the romantic narratives of manifest destiny to reveal a calculated campaign of territorial acquisition through military force against a weaker neighbor. The celebration of manifest destiny has given way to critical examination of the racist assumptions and imperial ambitions that drove American expansion. Earlier historians portrayed westward expansion as the natural fulfillment of American democratic principles, but contemporary scholars recognize manifest destiny as ideological justification for territorial conquest and cultural domination. This concept assumed American racial and cultural superiority over Mexican and Native American populations, creating moral frameworks that justified dispossession and violence. Modern academic analysis reveals how manifest destiny served political and economic interests rather than divine providence or democratic idealism. Current scholarship on Mexican-American relations traces contemporary tensions directly to the unresolved trauma of territorial conquest during the 1840s. The war created patterns of mistrust, cultural domination, and economic exploitation that continue to influence bilateral relationships nearly 2 centuries later. Mexican historians and politicians still reference the war as evidence of American imperial ambitions, while American policymakers struggle with the legacy of territorial expansion achieved through military aggression. This historical memory shapes everything from immigration debates to trade negotiations, with the war's consequences reverberating through every aspect of contemporary Mexican-American interaction. The Mexican-American War established the template for American interventionism that would define foreign policy for generations, creating precedents for using military force to achieve political and economic objectives abroad. The successful conquest of Mexican territory demonstrated that America could project power beyond its borders to secure strategic advantages, establishing patterns that would be repeated in the Spanish-American War, various Caribbean interventions, and global conflicts throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Contemporary foreign policy analysts recognize the Mexican-American War as the moment when America discovered its capacity for imperial expansion and developed the institutional frameworks necessary for sustained international intervention. Demographic statistics from 2025 reveal the permanent consequences of territorial conquest in ways that 19th-century Americans could never have imagined. The territories seized from Mexico now contain 89 million American residents, representing nearly 27% of the total United States population concentrated in former Mexican lands. These demographic concentrations create political and economic influence that extends far beyond regional boundaries, affecting national elections, congressional representation, and federal policy decisions. The cultural transformation of these territories has been so complete that most residents remain unaware they live on land that belonged to Mexico within living memory of their great-great-grandparents. The psychological wound of losing half its national territory continues to affect Mexican national identity and political discourse in profound ways that American observers often fail to understand. Mexican textbooks, political speeches, and cultural narratives still reference the war as a foundational trauma that shaped modern Mexican consciousness about American power and territorial vulnerability. This historical memory influences Mexican foreign policy calculations, immigration attitudes, and economic relationships with the United States. The loss of territory represents more than geographical change. It symbolizes Mexican powerlessness in the face of American expansion and technological superiority. Many modern American history texts now incorporate Mexican viewpoints and native populations, reflecting a balanced narrative that presents multiple perspectives rather than traditional triumphalist accounts. These educational reforms face political resistance from groups that prefer traditional patriotic narratives, creating ongoing debates about how American schools should teach controversial historical events. The struggle over historical memory in classrooms reflects broader cultural conflicts about American identity and national mythology. Contemporary immigration and border issues cannot be understood without reference to the war's legacy and the demographic transformations it created. The current border between the United States and Mexico was established through military conquest rather than negotiated agreement, creating artificial divisions that separated Mexican families and communities. Modern immigration flows often represent people attempting to reunite with relatives or return to ancestral lands that became American territory through warfare. The militarization of the border, Debates over immigration policy and cultural conflicts in southwestern states all trace their origins to the territorial conquest achieved between 1846 and 1848. Understanding the Mexican-American War provides essential context for analyzing patterns of American foreign policy that persist into the 21st century. The successful use of manufactured provocations to justify military intervention, the combination of moral rhetoric with imperial objectives, and the transformation of conquest into legitimate territorial acquisition all became standard features of American international relations. Contemporary conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere follow strategic and rhetorical patterns established during the Mexican-American War, suggesting that the conflict created enduring institutional and cultural approaches to international relations. Modern Mexican communities throughout the conquered territories maintain cultural connections to their pre-conquest heritage while adapting to American political and economic systems. These populations represent living bridges between Mexican and American cultures, preserving languages, traditions, and historical memories that complicate simple narratives of successful American expansion. Their experiences illuminate the human costs of territorial conquest and the ongoing challenges of cultural preservation within dominant Anglo-American society. The forgotten nature of the Mexican-American War in popular American consciousness contrasts sharply with its central importance in shaping contemporary American society and international relations. Most Americans remain unaware that their nation's current geographic boundaries, economic advantages, and global strategic position result directly from territorial conquest during the 1840s. This historical amnesia prevents understanding of how military expansion created the foundation for American prosperity and power that continues to benefit the nation's residents today. This historical blindness obscures how profoundly the Mexican-American War shaped the nation Americans inhabit today. California's $3.6 trillion economy exists because military conquest seized Pacific ports and fertile valleys for Mexico between 1846 and 1848. The technology, agriculture, and energy industries that define modern American prosperity all operate on territories acquired through aggressive warfare against a weaker neighbor. Many Americans remain unaware that this conflict shaped today's economic and geographic landscape in ways that continue generating national wealth and global influence. The forgotten war that created Continental Empire remains the foundation of American power nearly 2 centuries after the last shots were fired.